Hello everyone, welcome to The Old Man and the Read. My name is Jerry. Today I'm going to talk about the books I've read by Sinclair Lewis. One of the problems I've discovered being an old man and talking about books is some of these books I read a long time ago, some up to 50 or 60 years ago. Sinclair Lewis, most of what I read, probably about 30 or 40 years. So I've had to brush up on the books and kind of make myself little notes to let me know what I'm going to say. So I'll give it a try. Now, Sinclair Lewis is known mostly for his satire. He had a stream of humor going through most of his books, and sometimes it would get just really outrageously funny. But he has a very unique style, and to me, I've always thought that you could take a paragraph or two from any book, and anybody that's familiar with his work would recognize it as Sinclair Lewis when he read it. Some of the uniqueness about it is that he had like an unreal quality, or that's what I felt anyway, to people's reactions to things, and then in their dialogue, just things that you wouldn't expect people to normally say. But I found that rather enjoyable. He wrote back in the early 1900s. He lived from 1885 to 1951, and most of his really popular books were written in the 20s and 30s. So he used a lot of the slang from that period. Anyway, I find it, he's not necessarily one of my most favorite authors, but quite enjoyable. So he was politically, if he were alive today, would be considered a progressive. He was an advocate for women's rights and racial injustice. So he was considered a leftist, but still a lot of it I very much agree with. So I'll begin with the books of his that I've read. Now, he began his career as a short story writer in various publications, and the first book I have is If I Were Boss, and this is basically a collection of the short stories he wrote early in his career. Very enjoyable short stories, though. His first novel that I read was written in 1914. He did, I think, have one previous book he wrote, but this is the earliest one of his that I read. Our Mr. Wren. This is about a meek accounting clerk who really is bored with life, hates his job, and dreams of adventure. And then he receives a modest inheritance, and so he quits his job and decides to seek adventure and goes to Europe. He was in Europe for a while, got in a little bit of a romance, but then he suddenly finally realized, he was just as bored in Europe as he was in America, and basically returned back to his previous life. The next book is The Trail of the Hawk. This was written in 1915, and it's about a miscontent who is expelled from college. He becomes a bit of a vagabond, going from one odd job to another, and just at loose ends. And then he decides he wants to become an aviator. Now, this was back in the day when aviation was just beginning, and they were flying what they called flying machines, and most of them were fairly experimental. But he became a well-known aviator, had the nickname of Hawk Erickson. But as he was going, he started noticing that a lot of the aviators that period were dying in air accidents, and he decided to quit that and pursue other venues. He last portion of the book is mostly dedicated to a romantic affair he was in, and but anyway, that's the book. In 1917, he wrote The Job, and this was about women emerging into the workplace. This is about a woman named Una Golden who wants to become a stenographer, or becomes a stenographer, and it's basically about her struggles to try to advance in her job. This is during a period when women were expected to just marry, have a family, and be subservient to their husbands. So she was kind of a breaking new ground. In 1919, he wrote Free Air, and this is actually one of my favorite of Sinclair Lewis's books. It's about a young woman who comes from wealth but decides to drive from New York to Seattle. Now, this was back in the time when roads were just dirt and mud. Cars broke down consistently, tires punctured. So it's about her adventure driving across the country. Sinclair wrote this for the period, so people, just expected those conditions. It wasn't considered abnormal at all. But it's a great story. She gets involved with a little bit of a romance, but it becomes kind of a clash between classes, because she comes from a wealthy family and the man she met is just working class. In 1920, Main Street was published, and this was probably his first really big book. It's a satire of small town America, but it's about a young woman who marries a doctor and moves to a town called Gopher Prairie, Minnesota. And basically it's about her attempts to try to remake the town. In 1922 is Babbitt. This is a satire of middle-class America. It has no plot, but it's a man who he's married, has a wife and children, but he becomes dissatisfied with his life, and so he quits his job and becomes basically a nonconformist. But eventually he realizes that's not for him, and he returns to the family. 1925 is Aerosmith. Now this book was considered one of the first to feature science and medicine, but it's about a man who goes to medical school and then opens a small private practice in a small town. But he becomes involved in a few relationships and romances, but he tires of this, and then he joins a staff in a hospital, and eventually goes into medical research, and he makes a medical discovery. In 1926 is Man Trap. This is about a city slicker New York lawyer who gets talked into going on a northern Canada adventure, outdoor adventure, up in the far north. So it's basically about his attempts to try to do that event that he was totally unsuited for. In 1927 is Elmer Gantry. Now this is a satire on religion, and it's about a man who's a drunkard and a womanizer who becomes a Baptist minister and then eventually an evangelist. But it's basically about him living a life just completely the opposite of what he's preaching. 1928 is The Man Who Knew Coolidge. This isn't one of Sinclair's better known books, but it actually is one of my favorites. It's 6 satirical stories, all of them featuring a travel salesman named Lowell Schmaltz. Now, Lowell Schmaltz is just a real motor mouth, just talks consistently, and just rambles on, and that's basically the story. All 6 stories are that. My favorite stories were is the title story, The Man Who Knew Coolidge, and it's basically about Schmaltz bragging about knowing Calvin Coolidge when actually he was in one class in college, really didn't know the man, but he blew it up in his mind that he did. And then another story that I really enjoyed was the story. It's called The Story by Mac McMack, and it's about Schmaltz in a poker game, rambling on and on about this Mac McMack. And he starts his story, and then it drifts into another story, and he never quite completes any of what he's talking about. And eventually he concludes with a joke that he forgot the punchline to. But very funny stories. 1929 is Dodsworth. This is a man who had a successful automobile business, and he sells it and retires at the age of 50. He and his wife then becomes involved in the socialite crowd, and but they continue traveling around Europe, but eventually they both become romantically involved with other people. 1933 is Ann Vickers. This is it's a story about a woman from her early school days up until into her 40s, I guess it was. But she was a suffragette who was arrested and imprisoned. And this led her to go into social work and prison reform. She eventually gets into a kind of an unhappy marriage, but then meets a judge, and the story goes on from there. 1935 is a book called It Can't Happen Here, and this is a dystopian political novel. It's about a man. It's disturbingly familiar with some of the events that have happened in recent years, but it's about a man who's elected president. He runs on a platform of patriotism and traditional values, a lot of his campaigning, he's creating fear and promising reform. But once he's elected, then he starts gaining power, takes over complete control of the government, and becomes a dictator. In 1938 is The Prodigal Parents, and this is a satire of a well-to-do family. It's about a family with two spoiled kids. It kind of reflects the period they're in. The two kids are advocating for communism, and basically they resent their parents' capitalism, even though that's the same capitalism that is giving them the affluent life that they live. 1940 is Bethel Meriday, and it's basically about a girl who dreams of becoming an actress. I didn't care for the book as much. It lacked his usual satire and the snappy dialogue that he likes to insert. So I didn't care for the book as much. 1943 is a small book. I think it was basically just a short story that was made into a book titled Harry, and it's about an overly ambitious woman who's very incompetent, but she moves into a small town and tries to control other people's lives. It's kind of familiar or similar to Main Street, I thought. 1943 is Gideon Planish, and this is about a man who dreams of success but never achieves it, and he gets involved in fraudulent charities and just goes from one venture to another. 1945 is Cass Timberlane. This is a story about a marriage between an older judge and a much younger woman, and it's basically about the conflicts they go through different situations. 1947 is King's Blood Royal. This is about a story about a middle-class man who finds that he has a black ancestor that he's descended from, and this fact becomes known to his acquaintances, and it slowly starts becoming known to other people, and he basically loses his job. Is beginning to be treated differently and experiences racism. He's has to move out of his white-only neighborhood. So it's a satire on racism by Sinclair Lewis. 1949 is The God Seeker. This is really kind of an unusual book for Sinclair Lewis. It's a historical novel, pre-Civil War era, but it's about a man who goes west to spread the word of God to the Indians. But when he gets there, he starts seeing the hypocritical lives of the white people and starts beginning to prefer the Indian people. And it's basically he eventually finds love and then starts leading a secular life. And the last book of Sinclair Lewis is World So Wide, written in 1951. And this is about a man who's severely injured in a car accident that kills his wife. after he recovers, he goes to Europe to put his life back together, and he gets involved in a very strange romantic relationship, and then Sinclair Lewis threw in a twist at the very end. So those are the books by Sinclair Lewis that I've read. I want to thank you for watching, and I hope to be doing another video here soon. Thanks.